And we're back. Welcome back to another episode. And today we're going to be talking on the concept of a function. Specifically, we're going to start hitting on what is a function, how do we use functions in C++, and why and when would we use a function when programming. So, what is a function? A function is a block of code that performs a specific task. There are functions all around us, but unless we start actively looking for them or framing problems and concepts of functions, it can be difficult to recognize where they are. Let's take your alarm clock, for example. Your alarm clock is really just a function. The input is the time you set, and the output is the blaring large noise you hear whenever that time occurs. A more common example is Google search. The input is whatever you've typed into the computer, and it could be anything from what's the best spaghetti in town to how do I write code. And the output are the hundreds of search results you get that tell you the answer to your question. The key thing to remember here are just functions are ways of organizing thoughts or ideas in your head into concepts of repeatable tasks that will always do the same thing given an input. Let's think about what it means to have a function on the iPad. A function really only has three parts. It is going to have a name, an input, and an output. Now, notice I did not include in here what the function actually does. That's because you may end up using a function that someone else writes, or you may use a function yourself where you have written and described what it does. So there's an optional part called the body of a function. Now, just like variables start off with type, name, equals value with a semicolon, our functions are going to start off very similar. A function definition is going to start off with a type, a name, and then we'll be adding two empty parentheses followed by curly brackets. Now, the type here is going to be just like variable definitions. It can be an int, it can be a float, it can be a character, it could be any type you want your function to return, or any output you want your function to produce. Some of you may be asking, this looks similar. This looks like the code we see whenever we first create a new REPL. And that code is int main parentheses. And you'd be right. Main is a function here. In fact, main is the first function that any program will call. The reason we've indicated your program will always begin in main is because C++ is designed so that main is the entry point to your program. Main is effectively the first function being called. Let's say, for example, I had a function that looked like the following. Int get number from user. Now, this function has a return type of an integer, so I'm expecting it to give me a number back. The function is called get number from user. Now, just like variable names, you can name your functions anything you want. They don't have to be related to what your function does. However, for readability and to make it so that your code is actually understandable, you often want to make it so your function is named something that is hopefully related to what that body or the body of your function is going to do. So in this case, I called my function getNumber from user. Now, how do we get numbers from a user? We first make a new variable in our function called int number. We then call std cin console input into the number. So at this point, we would have a number entered from the user as the value of our number variable. Now, this is the part that often confuses people. How do we get the function to indicate, I want you to give this number to whoever called me, or I want this number to be the output of the function? The trick here is to use the keyword called return. Return says, I want you to take whatever value I provide next and give that back as the output. So in this case, the value I want to provide as the output is the value of the variable number, and I'll put a semicolon there. So this function, get number from user, returns an integer or produces an integer as an output, and right over here I will be returning the variable number as the output of this function. Now, in order to call this function, I could say get number from user semicolon. Notice when I call it, I don't give it a type, I don't give it a value, I simply have called it by name like I do in a variable. Whenever I want to use a variable, I just use it by the name of the variable. Similarly, if I want to use a function, not create a function, I will just use it by name. Let's go over and deep dive onto the REPL so we can see how this code will actually compile and what it will do. So right now in our REPL, I have written code in our existing main function, which is going to take an input from a user. Let's transform it into using the get number from user function. So first, I'm going to declare the type of the function, int. Then I'll be naming it the function, get number from user, adding the parentheses and then the body inside the scope of the function. And I'll write out the code again. Number, cn, number. And lastly, I'll be returning the number. The key thing to note here is return gets highlighted, just like int or include. Return is a key word that is used in C++. Return is the keyword that lets you set a variable to be set as the output of that function. Now the key part of using return is that once you return something, you will not be able to execute any more of the function. The function will simply terminate. And then lastly, I'll be using this function in get number from user. So inside the main function, I'm calling another function that is called get number from user. Let's see what happens when I run this code. When I run this code, the screen pauses, I give it a number, and then that's all the code will do. That's because I haven't actually used the function to do anything meaningful. If I wanted to do that, I needed to take the output of that function, get number from user, and actually use it in my main function for something productive. Let's see how we might do that. Because I'm getting a value from the function get number from user, I need somewhere to store that value. The only place that we've learned that we can store values is another variable. So in order for me to store the value or to use the value I'm getting from the get number from user function, I must use it. I must use it when related to related to a variable. So the first thing I need is a variable. Let's say int user variable. And then I can assign the value that the function returns over into my variable. Let's walk through this on our memory table to see what happens. So as per usual, our memory table is going to start off with scope, type, name, value, size. But we're going to add one more column in here called a function name to the very left. So, as always, we're going to start off on line 9, which is where our main function begins. Our function name is going to be main. The type of this function is going to be an integer because it returns an integer. The name column is not useful because this is a variable name column, not a function name column. Now, I don't write out variable name. I just assume that this column means variable name. But if you'd like to specify it for yourself, feel free to write out the full column name. The value as of now is unknown, and the size of this is going to be 4 since it's going to be an integer. Now, line 9 indicates that I want to create a new scope, and this is going to begin on line 9. Line 10 indicates I want to create a new variable of type int and name user variable. Now again, the value of this variable is unknown, and the size is 4. Line 11 says whatever the user variable will be whatever get number from user returns. So I know I'm going to be calling another function. Whenever you call a function, you're simply going to write the function name in the function on the next line. So this will be called get number from user. The type of this function, we have to go up to see what the return type is. The return type is going to be an int, so we're going to fill in int over there. Again, it's a function, so it's not a variable name. The value as of now is unknown, and the size is going to be 4. Then on line 3, I'll end up creating a new scope. Line 4 tells me to make a variable named integer. Well, to make an integer variable named number. The value of this variable is also unknown, but it's of size 4. Line 5 asks the user for input to set as the value for the number variable. Let's say I had typed in the number 99. In that case, the number variable's new value will be 99. And then line 6 has the keyword called return. So what are we going to do in our memory table when we have return? So first off, we're going to take note of what is the variable being returned. Let's circle it. The value of the variable being returned is 99. We are then going to fill in the 99 for our function's value. So the value of our function is going to return 99. And then, because we hit the return keyword, what we're saying is we're done with this function. Not only are we done with this function, we're going to be done with all of the scope up until where we define the function. So that means we are going to completely cross out every single line up until the function. And since we've crossed it out, we'll go back to where this function was called from. And this function was called from line 11. Now, if you remember, line 11 asks us to assign the value of the get number from user function. So the value of this function is 99, and we wanted to assign it to the user variable. So let's go ahead and assign that. And then we're going to be done with this line. So now that we're done with this line, this function is finally over. And then lastly, we're going to go on to line 12, which will tell us to end the scope, and we're going to go all the way up. Now, you might be wondering, what about the main function? I didn't return it, and it's kind of at the top of my memory table. How do I deal with that? Well, that's an excellent question. Because the main function returns an integer or a number, and we have a question mark as its value, we actually did what's really, really bad practice in programming. What we should always guarantee is if a function returns something, we should always give it a valid output. So let's add a return statement here. But what number do we return? Does it make sense to return the number 85, 42, -1, 0? Well, the main function is a special function. So all programs are going to use a very common return code called 0 to indicate success. So right now, since our program succeeds at doing what we want it to do, we're going to return 0. Almost always, until you finally start building more complicated programs, you'll want the main function to return 0. Let's go back a couple steps on our memory table. When I return the value of 0, once line 11 is over, line 13 happens. Line 13 says, take the value that I'm returning and set that as the value of my function, and then cross out everything up until the function. And then we'll be giving that value to whoever called the main function. In this case, it'll be the REPL program. So it will ask me for a user input because I'm calling the get number from user variable. So let's enter the number 99, and then the program will close. That was a lot. I want to slow it down and reiterate some of the key facts that we did. Because we're talking about functions, we had to go ahead and add a new column to our memory table, and that is the function name column. Every time we enter a function, we're going to do a couple of things. We're going to write the function name. That will include the return type of the function. At first, it is impossible to know the value of the function until we finally return from it. So we'll have a question mark there. The size of the function will be exactly what the size of the type is. And then every single time we enter a function, we'll also be entering a brand new scope, because the body of a function is described in the scope that immediately follows the function definition. And then we're going to execute it just like our regular memory table would. There's one small hiccup that you have to remember. Remember whenever we used variables in our memory table for std/cout or adding them or assigning them, and we would search in our memory table for where the value lives? Once you enter a function, you can't use any values that are above that function on the memory table. So for example, in this code, when you're in the get number from user function, you are not allowed to use any code above that line on your memory table. And that's because functions are scoped. You can only use variables that live within the function you're currently in. So your memory table is a great visual aid for you to realize and use whatever variables are there. If a variable is not below that line on the memory table, it's not accessible to your function. It's not within the function's scope. And secondarily, you can only ever be in one function at a time. How you got to that function, you might have called 10 other functions all the way up to get into it. However, at any given time, you can only be in one specific function. So at this point in my code, according to my memory table, I am in the get number from user function, even though I've called it from the main function. Once I cross these lines out and I return that value, I am now back in the main function and I am no longer in the get number from user function. Why would we want these functions? Does it make our life easier? Some of you might argue that if I just put all of this code directly in the main function, you might be able to understand it more clearly, and your memory table would be simpler. Well, let's say I wanted to get two numbers from a user, and then I wanted to add them together. I could have done what we had done in the homework lesson 2. However, I'm going to show you a new way to look at that same problem and see what the results end up looking like. We could have one variable named user variable 1, where we get the number from a user, followed by a second variable named user variable 2. And sum is equal to user variable 1 plus user variable 2. And lastly, we're going to be printing out what the sum is. Let's go ahead and try running this code and seeing what happens. So the first thing is my code is asking me for user input, so I'm going to pass in 10 and 12. And it tells me the sum is 22. However, it's not very obvious when I first run the program that I want user input. So I might do something to my get number from user function. So right before I ask for user input, I tell them, hey, I would like you to enter a number. Std out. Let's see what happens when I run this code now. The first thing it's going to do, it's going to ask me to enter a number. I'm going to enter a number 10. It's going to ask me to enter an integer again. I'm going to enter the integer 12. And once again, my sum is 22. Now, even though I only wrote enter an integer one time in my code, I got it to print out twice in my output or my console. And the reason I got it to print out twice is because I called the get number from user function 2 times. So every single time I call a function, it's going to be doing that code or that block or that task every single time I call it. And that's it. We just walked through an example using function calls. Passing in inputs into your function is going to be a little bit, is going to stretch your mind a little bit more. I don't want to cover that in this video because I want to challenge you to start discovering how this might work when I show you some example code. I will show you the code. When you see these, I'd like you to ask questions and determine if you sufficiently understand how inputs work. We're going to cover this up in a follow-up video, so don't worry. There will be a rigorous definition for exactly how inputs work into functions. But for now, I want to stick to using just these high-level functions that only have outputs and don't take in any inputs. That's it for this time. Looking forward to seeing you again. Adios.